logistics of data-driven development, right? So, again, I think a lot of people look at free-to-play and it's like, oh, well, it's just a spreadsheet with a graphical interface or whatever. And I don't necessarily think that's true. Analytics does play a big part, I think, in free-to-play game development, but mostly for the purposes of making the game better for people, right? Like recognizing what doesn't work and fixing it. I don't think that is necessarily like an anti-consumer function. I feel like that's a pro-consumer thing, making the game better, right? So analytics sort of driving experimentation then. So you get some data, the data says something doesn't work, then you experiment with different versions of that something, and then iterating, right? And I feel like free-to-play mobile games, like they have these long development cycles, but I think free-to-play games are generally kind of anti-MVP, especially with like larger studios. They don't just soft launch something that they iterate on really quickly, endlessly. Sometimes they do, and I'll get to that. But they are sort of agile, I think. And to the extent that they can be on the App Store, I feel like they sort of iterate. Free-to-play is a very good sort of format for iterating and updating quickly. On Android, it's much better. So, having gone over sort of like the philosophy of marketing for mobile gaming and then sort of the idea behind data-driven development, I'll talk about soft launch strategy. And then this actually brings the talk back to Jelly Splash. So, what is a soft launch? It's an opportunity to gather player feedback. So this might be in the form of reviews. People say, "Oh, this game sucks." Or actually talking to people, doing bringing people into your office and having them play it, getting qualitative feedback. It's a chance to get market feedback. So what are the CPIs when I try to run ads? How much do I have to pay to get someone to click on an ad? And then how big could this game be? I mean, like, do people like playing it? Could I build a big user base off of this game? And then it's the opportunity to iterate on the game before you show it to a lot of people, right? So like when I was talking about the brutally sort of competitive nature of the App Store, the thing is like the switching cost from one free-to-play game to another is obviously zero. So if you show a person the game that sucks, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt that it gets better after 5 minutes. They're just going to delete it immediately, right? So when you soft launch a game, it usually sucks. You don't want to show a lot of people this sucky game, right? Because not only will they delete it immediately, not give you the benefit of the doubt, or even like sort of walk through one full sort of game loop, but they're going to remember that it sucked. And even if you improve upon it and then 6 months later show them an ad, they're not going to click on it. They'll be like, oh yeah, I played that game, it sucked, right? So when you have a crappy game, you want to show it to as few people as possible while still gathering this feedback and making it better, right? That's the purpose of a soft launch, I think. And then scalability, so like I said, I mean, does this game grow on its own? Like, how much do we have to spend per unit to acquire a user? Is it really viral, and therefore like our acquisition costs decrease and our effective acquisition cost is like half because we get 2 users per user that we acquire? Or do we have to acquire every single user that plays our game? And that gives you a sense of how big could this game get given your balance sheet, given the amount of money you have available to acquire users. So length of a soft launch is pretty variable. So it depends on like what your metrics targets are and how far you have to go to reach them. And I think like a lot of times you'll see like a prototype or like kind of an early stage game go to soft launch, and it's like day one retention is like 15% and they just kill it immediately. Like they know that, okay, for this kind of, let's say it's a casual puzzle game, we need 50% day one retention, it's 15, we're not going to get there. There's no amount of iteration we could do to get there. Or maybe we know, okay, if we iterate on this for 2 years, we could get to 50%, but the opportunity cost is too great to do that. You might kill it immediately. But then if you launch it and it's like 35%, okay, we could do 15%. It's going to be a longer soft launch cycle. Or if it's like 50%, it's like, hey, perfect. So that kind of defines how long the soft launch will be. The completeness of the game. So if you're just testing sort of the core mechanic of the game, you might almost put out like what's a demo. And that wouldn't really be a soft launch. That would be just like a very, very early data gathering mission. So just a few soft launches just for just to show the spectrum. So Clash of Clans was in soft launch for about 2 months before it launched. Pet Rescue Saga about 1 month. obviously the King games go through kind of a different type of soft launch because they all launch on Flash first. The Hobbit, Kingdoms of Middle-earth, less than 1 month. At the same time, this was basically a clone of Kingdoms of Camelot, so they probably knew a lot about how it would perform. And then Boom Beach was in soft launch for quite a while, and then it actually went to Australia as well as Canada in the soft launch, which I think a lot of developers are doing now. They're launching, they'll do Canada and then New Zealand, Australia, just so that there's kind of like always data coming in. And now it's getting really hard to soft launch exclusively in Canada just because it's hard to get enough volume because so many companies are soft launching there. So what is the focus of a soft launch? Retention, so making sure that retention metrics hit the targets you've set for them, and virality. So retention as sort of like a focus of the soft launch. Why is it important? Here's kind of like a generic retention curve. It probably wouldn't look like this, but this would be like more of a projection. So you've got day 0, which is when the cohort enters the game, and then it just basically gets cut in half, and then maybe like a gentle decline towards almost nothing. And this would be maybe probably like a more casual game where you actually got like 50% day 1 retention. I mean, this isn't like a real game. This isn't real game data. It's just an example. So retention, to my mind, is the most important metric. Why? Because it's sort of like a visceral sort of measurement of delight, right? If someone's coming back to your game, they probably like it. Like, it just, to me, this gives you the best insight into whether the game is good. And it's also like a key component of player lifetime, right? So if you have the retention curve, which looks like this, you can kind of roughly calculate projected player lifetime. So if you have this day 1 50% retention curve and it sort of degrades like this, then you might calculate a 37-day total lifetime based on like a 1-year projection, just as like sort of probabilities of coming back each day, summing those up. And then if you had 40%, you could calculate a 30-day total lifetime. So you can use this in like the very early stages of the game to kind of project, okay, how long would people play this game based on like 3 days of retention data. And then from that, player lifetime metric, you can sort of back into like a rough LTV calculation. So there's kind of 2 approaches to calculating LTV. So the first is kind of top-down, sort of like macro view, and just curve fitting monetization. So the way you do that is you have kind of cumulative monetization, cumulative spend per user since registration, and hopefully it sort of increases. And with the understanding that this would probably follow like a logarithmic trajectory, right? Like it wouldn't just go up forever, or maybe it would, I don't know, but you might assume that it wouldn't, and then you can kind of fit that curve onto your existing data, right? So if you've got data till here, you just kind of project it forward as a logarithmic curve, and then you could sort of say that the asymptote that it never actually reaches is LTV. And I gave this presentation at Slush, if you were there. And then the other approach is kind of bottoms up, so that's more like a micro, perspective on how you might use ARPDAU, average revenue per daily active user, to sort of calculate LTV. And this is, so if you had like some real retention rates like day 1, 2, 3, you'd plot that sample, and then you project out. So like this curve is sort of the opposite of the monetization curve, right? It's a decreasing exponential curve. You'd plot that out given the data that you already have, right? So this is retention. Then kind of the approach I described earlier where you sort of calculate the total lifetime, you calculate that on this curve, sort of by summing up all the values. And then you just multiply that times ARPDAU, right? So if you said the average user plays for this long, this many days, and then the average user spends this much per day, the average user's lifetime value, lifetime times value is this, and then you'd segment that, right? So that wouldn't be for the entire user base, but you'd say, you might segment that by any number of dimensions like device type, country of origin, acquisition channel, and then you could segment it also by all sorts of like day 1 or session 1 behavioral triggers, like they didn't complete the tutorial in less than 10 minutes or something like that. And then you you'd use these sort of like segments to model out LTV for various profiles of people. So distinct user groups. Yeah, and then I have the presentation I gave at Slush is just called this, and it's online. It comes in an Excel spreadsheet that you could use. Yeah, so then that kind of begs the question, all these projections that I did there with the logarithmic or the exponential curve, they just kind of go out, right? And so how long do you project those out for, right? Because if you project LTV out and it decreases over time, but you project it out over 5 years, there's still some values there at date, whatever 5 years is. So, and I think this kind of is like kind of controversial too in gaming, because like you hear Kabam and they say, okay, well we project LTV out for 2 years. Look at their games, and yeah, that seems reasonable because the games are pretty hardcore and probably people stick around for 2 years. But if you're making a super casual game, how long do people actually play it? I mean, I don't, if you had to project LTV out for Flappy Bird, I don't know that you could use 2 years. You probably couldn't even use 1 year. It's probably 6 months. I mean, there's probably very, very few people playing Flappy Bird after 6 months. So for casual games, I think 180 days is a good number. Which one reason that's nice is that LTV, if you kind of think about it over the long term, it's like a schedule of cash flows into your company, right, from a user. Well, if you project that past a year, you kind of have to discount it, right? You have to sort of like use the time value of money to say, okay, well, if I'm getting $1, in 2 years, it's not really worth the same as me putting out $1 today on acquisition, right? Because like, if I had the $1 right now, I could invest it and make some money on it and interest or whatever, or I could push it into this other project. So with less than, but you generally never discount less than a year. So if it's a 180-day timeline, you don't have to worry about it. And it's just, I think it's practical. I mean, if you have a casual game, chances are people aren't, a huge percentage of your cohort is not playing after 180 days. And so it just seems reasonable. And that's what we did with Jelly Splash. We used 180 days. If you use 365, it's no longer a current asset. You kind of have to discount it. But it would be better for a game that you think would retain people better. So the other focus of a soft launch is virality, right? So this kind of dictates how much you think you can spend per user in acquisition, right? Because if you have a highly viral game, you can spend more, right? Because if I buy 1 user, but then he tells his friend, I actually got 2 users, he's worth more to me than just the price of 1 user, right? I can't for the life of me remember why I put this here. I have notes, but I think I can't see them. You have the freedom to pay more, I don't know. So why is virality important? Because it basically acts as interest, right? So, if you just had the paid users, like each user you acquire brings in more users, and then those people bring in more users, and those people bring in more users, and it sort of compounds the growth of your user base. So that kind of begs the question though, like what is defined as virality, right? Because like I think the big problem a lot of mobile developers bump into is not so much that virality is ambiguous, but they refuse to accept the ambiguity, and they try to define, okay, this user was organic, but this user was viral, this user shouldn't count as viral. And it's just a headache, and you really can't do it. I mean, the tracking tools aren't good enough, the analytics tools aren't good enough, and it's just not a concept I think that's meant to be just very, very concrete. It's nebulous. You have to, just the idea of virality in itself, requires that you make a bunch of assumptions about how people talk about products to their friends, and so I think like when you try to quantify it, and but you refuse to accept the fact that you're making assumptions. You're going to be chasing sort of like this certainty that just is impossible to reach. But that said, you can sort of calculate rough approximations of what virality is for a game. So virality is generally expressed in this term called K-factor. And basically that just means the additional users per user you get to a game. So if my K-factor was 1, it means for every user I get, that user brings in another user. So it's effectively 2, right? And this is kind of an illustration of how that might look like. So this would be like a K-factor of 1, which means the game grows exponentially, right? So every user brings in another user, that user brings in another user, that user brings in another user, and it would grow like this. So there's kind of 2 approaches to calculating that. The first is bottoms up. This was sort of more relevant for Facebook games because you could track with like very precise granularity, the invites that people sent out from within the game, and then the conversions of those invites, right? Because Facebook gave you access to that data. You didn't get sort of like broader virality where someone just said, hey, you should play this game, I play on Facebook, it's really cool. But I don't think that made up like a substantive portion of user acquisition in Facebook gaming. I think generally people didn't really talk that much about Facebook games, they more just sent out the gift invites and stuff like that. But anyway, that's just, the calculating that is just the number of invites sent out per user times whatever the conversion rate of those invites were. So if each user on average sent out 10 invites, and then there was a conversion rate of 10%, you'd have one new user acquired. Top down is more rough, right? This is like more fuzzy. And that's just basically period to period non-paid growth, right? So if you're thinking about your cohorts in your mobile game, you know how much you spend every day. I mean, that's a certain number, right? I know I spent X every day. You generally know exactly how many users that got you, and then you know what the next day's new user number was, right? So if I have day X, let's call this day 1 of the game's launch, and we have DNU of whatever, daily new users. I know how many I paid for, and so I can just assume that the rest were organic, right? Because this is the first day the game is launched. No one could possibly be telling their friends about it. The rest just found the game. They found it on the App Store. They did a search. So there's organic and there's paid. Then I have day X plus 1, right, which is the next day. Well, I can probably assume the same number of people as in the day 1 are organic, right? Why would that change? If 200 people found my game just by searching on this day 1, the first day the game was out, why would that change to day 2? There's no reason that would change. I mean, it's not going to be exactly the same, but there's no reason you can assume that would change. It's probably about the same. Then I know exactly how many I paid for, right? So that the remainder, I can just assume they found out about the game through people that like were introduced to it on the first day, right? Because I know how many I paid for. I assume the same number were organic. The rest must have been told about it by one of the people that downloaded the day before, right? So I can call that viral. And then if I want to calculate my K factor, it's just the number of viral users divided by the total number of users from the day before, right? And I'm using days here, which is probably not realistic, right? Because I might download a game and then immediately tell my friend, and he might download it that day. But this is, I think, a good way to roughly approximate it. I mean, you're never going to get an exact number unless you just like interview every single one of your players, and then you're no longer really a gaming company, you're a polling company, and you probably won't make much money. So I think like people that get too obsessed with trying to like calculate exactly how many users come through virality are sort of like chasing their own tails. I think it's much more valuable to just come up with sort of like a heuristic like this and leave it at that. So yeah, this would be viral users divided by paid plus organic. So why is virality important? Virality is important because of this. So this is CPA, cost per action, or cost per acquisition. Effectively CPI, right? So if I say that action is the install of the game, it's CPI. So my effective CPI is the CPI I paid divided by 1 plus K factor, right? So that those bonus users I got come from the acquisition budget, right? So if I bought one user, he brought a friend in, I paid $5 for that user. I actually paid $2.50 per user, right? Because I got 2 users for $5. So when you look at it that way, having some sense of what your virality is allows you to spend more, right? Because if my budget is going to buy more users, right? Or on the other side, I can increase my budget. And if I know, yeah.
Yeah, question. What if you put a prompt in the game that says, how did you find about this game? And if you fill in any of the options, you get like 10 gems. Is that an option that you could?
I wouldn't trust that data. I think it would probably piss people off, or I don't. You could do that. I don't think it's gonna work.
Just to get a more concise reading.
Yeah, but again, I think you're really gonna put in an extra UI item into a game just to sort of make this a little bit more concrete. When in reality, I wouldn't trust that data anyway. I mean, it just seems like that's one of those extra steps companies go to that ends up doing more harm than good. So soft launch targets. So like when you do a soft launch, kind of you have some goals in mind. Generally, you're willing to say, okay, I accept the possibility that this game may not be good enough to launch globally. Therefore, it must meet some metrics thresholds for me to spend the money on marketing it globally. What are those thresholds, right? So generally, you might have an LTV threshold. probably a CPI target, and then you decide whether or not you're going to launch, or not. So now sort of talking about the actual logistics of the soft launch of Jelly Splash. We soft launched it in Canada on June 14th on 2 networks, Chartboost and Facebook. I think that's pretty normal. We achieved roughly 2K DNU. I think now, though, I mean, when we've done soft launches since, we've had to do more than just the 2 networks because it's getting competitive in Canada and it's really hard to actually get enough users to make decisions about. And that'd be up to you which other networks you use. So this is DNU for the soft launch. You can see that this is when we entered the Canadian App Store. This is roughly 2K DNU, and then we scaled it up a little bit as we prep for the global launch, just to sort of stress test the metrics. So what do we see in the soft launch? It was very viral. Average K factor of 92%. Strong retention, minimum 50% day 1 retention. I would tell you what it is, but I can't. I told them. So anyway, that was our goal. We had to have a minimum 50%, and it reached that. The CPI that we sort of hit was $2 on the iPhone, so that's what we were paying per user. And then sort of deciding, okay, do we globally launch this? We had to kind of, so we knew we had the metrics based on $2 CPI in Canada. You can assume a lot of the behavior is the same from Canada to the US. I mean, that's why people use Canada. So given these metrics about monetization, all that stuff, holding true for the US, would it be profitable to launch this game globally? And we didn't know. We didn't know what the CPI would be in the US. So putting all those metrics together for the soft launch, the K factor, the CPI, we came up with an effective CPI of $1.04, right? So we knew that if the LTV in the US would be more than $1.04, it'd be profitable, right? So the flip side of that is if we get a CPI, how does that, the question that we had to ask ourselves then is, okay, if the CPI at $2 is basically profitable, we can assume all these metrics hold for the US, except CPI. If we could achieve a $2 CPI, then we'd profit. So then we decided to launch Jelly Splash globally. We had to come up with a strategy. So we knew that per unit marketing was profitable at $1.04. We knew that Jelly Splash is a large addressable market because it's a very casual game. So for GDC, I came up with these 2 kind of concepts, right? So there's a ladder launch, which is slowly building a user base over time, or a trampoline launch where you just kind of go all in and build a huge user base very quickly, generally by paying more on a CPI basis. So what's a ladder launch? You run purely profitable campaigns, right? So we buy only the number of users that we can at a CPI that's profitable, and then the user base grows sort of over time like that. It's slower growth. We focus more on the unit economics, so the per user acquisition cost or the spread between LTV and the acquisition cost. And then what is a trampoline launch? Well, we sort of throw all that out the window. We say LTV can be less than CPI. We might pay more on a per user basis than LTV, but we aim for a chart position, right? We try to get top 10 downloaded chart position. Then we know that the organic installs that we get from that chart position will offset some of the loss we made on a per user basis. And instead of looking at the unit economics of profitability, we look at the user base economics of profitability, right? So if we get enough organic installs, we can offset completely the loss we made on a per user basis, and we actually be profitable, right? Even though we spent more per user than they were worth, we got those extra users from the chart position, we made more money than we spent. So the pros of a ladder launch is no launch risk, less money up front, which is actually a bigger concern I think people think about because your LTV is recouped over that timeline, right? 180 days maybe. So I put in $1 million in a launch budget. I'm not going to get that back immediately. I get that back over 12 months, right? If it's profitable. So you've still got to pay your employees, right? You've still got to keep the office open, keep the servers running. And I think that kind of LTV CPI thing, it can be misleading. I mean, this is money that you pay up front to recoup over the course of a year. So if you spend a lot up front, even if the campaign ultimately is profitable, if you run into a cash flow situation where you have to lay off your team, the game might ultimately fail, even though the user base economics are profitable. It's easy to update. With a ladder launch, you run the campaign, and you don't really commit to anything. It's just you're just buying ads. So if it's not profitable, you stop it that day, right? And you haven't you haven't spent the money that you had scheduled to spend. The cons, you're leaving money on the table. If you could do the trampoline launch profitably, you're leaving money on the table because you're going to get this money later. The user base probably won't scale to like its potential before the game kind of becomes stale and people don't want to play it anymore. And you can't really predict the market dynamics. I mean, you might have if you launched a Clash of Clans clone now, you know, obviously you're not going to make any money. It's saturated. But like if you launched it right after Clash of Clans became big, you might have made some money. But you wouldn't have been able to know how long do I have, how much time do I get, right before it becomes saturated. There's no way to predict that. You don't know. So. Yeah, and if your marketing strategy is to build the user base over a long timeline, well, if 6 months after you launch, the game is no longer really attractive to the market, you didn't seize those users when you could have. Trampoline launch pros, bigger network effects. So if I put a lot of money in early, the virality spreads faster, right, and I get those more users earlier. And then the time value of money. So if I want to make my money now, if I have 1 million potential users for this game, I'd rather have them all playing now and spending now than over the course of 12 months because I want that money now. Cons is a huge upfront commitment. So you'll push all this money into a campaign that might last a week as opposed to 6 months. So you need that money then, and it's gone as soon as you spend it. And then the value at risk is difficult to evaluate because you're basically you would make this decision on a pretty limited set of data, and there's no way to test it in the broader market, because if you spend all this money in 7 days, you're not really going to get any sense of whether it's working or not until probably at least 3 days. And then if it's not working, that money's gone, right? There's no way to know that in a soft launch situation. So just to illustrate the effects of compounding, here's a game with a K factor of 20% over 10 periods, so that might be a day, a month, or whatever. Yeah. So the green line is the game that basically got 1 million users in day one, right? So they advertised and converted 1 million users in day one. They did the trampoline launch, and you see the user base growth because it has this 20% K factor. This one was more conservative. They did the latter launch. And the ultimate size of the user base is much less, even though it's the same K factor and the same number of users acquired, right? This guy acquired 1 million users in 1 day. This guy acquired 1 million users over 10 periods. And the ultimate size of the user base is much lower. So we got to this point with Jelly Splash where we had these great metrics, and we had to decide, okay, are we going to do ladder launch or trampoline launch? So the idea was that we wanted to sort of estimate what would this cost be, how much would this cost. So the goal was to get a #1 chart position on iPhone in the US. We assumed a US CPI of $2, and we knew just from me kind of asking people, how much would a top chart position, top 10 cost, or how many installs would that require then? And then this is a year ago. This is different now. And what I sort of was able to weasel out of people was that it was about 20,000 installs per day. So, so then we went to Destimo, and we gathered data from that, right? And what they said was that in August 2013, this is how many downloads a top 10 position generated, 20K generated installs a day. So the organic effect. So Destimo said, okay, to get to top 10, you needed 66,000 installs, and at a CPI of $2, that was 132 grand, right? Top 3 was 113,000 installs, and top 1 was 140,000. And this is what Destimo said. This wasn't verifiable at the time. We didn't know if this was true or not. It's just what Destimo said. But we had a K factor of nearly 1, right? So actually we could adjust those numbers down. We don't have to buy all of those installs. We only have to buy half, because the other half will come from sort of viral channels, or viral spread. So the actual numbers, were cut in half, right? And the actual costs were cut in half. But there was something weird about it, because if you look at these numbers, they scale kind of linearly, right? But like freemium never works like that. There's nothing about freemium, nothing about the App Store that looks like that. so we sort of estimated that this linear growth pattern should actually look like this. And we sort of fit that, so it's an increasing exponential function. Means that the rate of the price increase is actually increasing. So like the number of, the rate at which the users we need to reach rank actually increases. So we thought that those ranks, 10, 3, and 1, should be separated by an order of magnitude, not just some linear growth in number of users. So we established target markets, and the goal was to reach number 1 in all of these. And given that sort of exponential increase that we sort of assumed, we figured that the cost of reaching number 1 in those countries was this. This is iPhone. So the true cost is the top row, and then the sort of adjusted cost, basically what we have to spend to get to that number of users that we need to get to number 1, was cut in half because we had the K factor of 1. And this isn't insane, right? I mean, you hear about launch budgets in like $5-10 million, but this isn't. I mean, granted, this is a year ago, and lots changed since then, but this wasn't outrageous. So we decided to go for it. And we did go for it. And we got to number 1. So the kind of the general strategy was, given the 92% K factor, $2 CPI, we needed $150,000 for launch week. And to give ourselves like some room, we set the budget for $250,000. So this is the first week, not like sort of follow-on marketing. So the logistics of the global launch, we staggered it. So we didn't do all those countries in one day. We did 1 country per day, except for France, which we did at the same time as the US. And the reason we did that, there wasn't any grand strategy behind that. It's just that we were only 5 people. We have a pretty small marketing team. Wooga's 300 people, and only 5 people are on marketing team. So it was too much to handle to do all the countries at once. We released the game globally on a Thursday on 23 networks. And we did sort of a burst campaign in each country. And when I say burst campaign, that's basically just that concept of the trampoline launch. So we spend more money on a per user basis than we think we're going to get back, generally at a pre-negotiated CPI. So we knew how much traffic we needed to get, or how many users we needed to convert from ads to reach number 1. We reached out to all these different networks. We said, hey, we're launching this big launch. We need X amount of installs. Can you do that? And they were all like, yeah, of course, no problem. We knew they were probably full of it. So we over budgeted the amount of sort of traffic that we generated by 25%. Then we did like social media outreach, which Wooga has more than 20 million Facebook fans. And we did cross promotion from Wooga titles. So we had other iOS games, and then we sort of sent traffic to Jelly Splash on the launch. This was the schedule. So the game had actually launched on a Thursday, but we didn't put any money into it. We started putting money into it the next day. And we did get some featuring from Apple. So what were the results? We got number 1 in all target countries, reached 1 million downloads in 5 days. We reached top 10 in other key countries, so some of the Nordics and the UK. And this is all iPhone, so not iPad or Android. We launched Android later. So post-launch, some things that we observed, because we had strong retention, the revenue didn't just drop. So we did the burst. It rocketed up to number 1. It stayed top 10, I think, for 2 weeks in the US, and then sort of like slowly declined. We weren't spending nearly as much money after that. We were spending some. But because we had really strong retention, the revenue didn't just drop as soon as we reduced the marketing spend. So this is DNU and then revenue. So the dotted line is revenue. And so you can see, okay, here's where it peaked. I believe that's the US campaign. And then it sort of like steadily declined. And I think each one of these plateaus is kind of corresponds to like dropping out of a significant rank. So this first plateau, I think, is when we dropped out of top 5, and then the second plateau is top 10. And then from there, it just sort of kind of consistently goes down. But revenue just went up, right? I mean, which makes sense because that cohort is sort of maturing, they're spending more money, but it didn't, and then it just sort of, well, it increased after this graph, but I think a lot of people are afraid of cutting off marketing spending and just seeing revenue drop, and it will if your game doesn't retain users, but if it does, I mean, you can do sort of like cohort-based acquisition campaigns where it's like once a week or something. You don't have to have like consistent marketing all the time if your game has strong retention. I mean, depending on what your goals are for growing the user base. So what did we learn? We learned that bursting can be profitable, so you can't, this was just kind of an idea before, can we actually offset the loss with the organic users? And the answer was yes, we did that. This was a profitable campaign. We learned about how much of an organic uplift you'll get from chart position. So top 10, we got about 30,000 DNU. So you'll remember that before the estimate was 20,000. Here it was 30,000. And I think that's just the nature of the App Store. This is probably going to increase again for like 2 years. This number, how much organic uplift you get by various chart position milestones. And then at top 3, we got 50,000 DNU. So this is extra. This is just pure people finding the game through the chart position. And then we also learned that most networks overpromised how much volume they could give us by about 20%. So we were, it was good of us to over budget. We learned that virality decayed pretty significantly over time. So K factor actually decreased to 84%, which means that the eCPI increased by 28%. And we learned that we had to kind of constantly add new networks into our traffic mix to keep the CPIs flat. And which makes sense, right? Because a network is plugged into like a finite number of games, and that number of games isn't just growing all the time, right? So the first people that click on your ad are probably the most enthusiastic about it, right? They're probably like, there's the least amount of, if you show an ad to someone one time, the people that need the least amount of convincing are going to click on it that first time. The people that need the most convincing won't, right? And so like the CPIs go up because you have to show the ad more times to get the clicks. That's the CPM. So what were the 4 key takeaways of this launch? I was grateful for a long soft launch, which, as the marketing guy, you'll get pressure. Hey, the metrics are good. Let's launch it. But I was grateful that we got the time that we needed to calculate virality. I learned that having some kind of reasonable, sensible LTV estimation allowed us to do all that sort of market research and estimation to sort of price this campaign out. Because I think, especially a year ago, you wouldn't say, hey, we could offset the loss with chart position with 250K. I don't think anybody would have bought that. Not that many people had experience sort of launching up to the number 1 spot with sort of performance marketing. People had experience getting there through like just sort of viral word of mouth growth, but I don't think there weren't that many people that said, okay, we're gonna take this budget, we're gonna use it to get to number 1. And so the assumption was that it must cost millions. And so we did this kind of, rough assumption-based projections, and we, based on the LTV estimation, and we like convinced ourselves that we could do it. And if we hadn't had that LTV estimation, I don't think we wouldn't have even gone through the exercise, and we wouldn't have done the trampoline launch. We learned that market analysis is just very, very important. I mean, kind of polling the market, seeing what it wants, testing the various ads, getting a sense for what CPI is. I mean, all that stuff is really important. And when you're talking about $1 million launches now, I mean, to just do it blindly without any sort of like market analysis, it just seems like pretty reckless. And we learned that virality is kind of the kingmaker. I mean, if you have a viral game, you just have such a competitive advantage, in terms of the sort of necessary marketing spend for chart position. And I think now the only way to reach the chart position, unless you just have a massive budget and a game that justifies a massive launch, is to be very viral. And implementing that is a lot harder than just calculating it. And that's up to the product guys. I don't claim to know anything about that. But without virality, I just don't see, a big sort of VC funded company level of success. Yeah, so if you want to learn more about Wooga or the games that it makes, you can check out wooga.com.